All right, are we ready to get into the scriptures? Yes. All right, I've been practicing. I've been trying to get some new questions ready because some of you are starting to catch on. You're like, oh, he always asks the same questions in the same sequence, huh? So how about this? Going to shake it up. How many books are in the books of Moses? And when I say the books of Moses, I'm referring to what part of the Old Testament? Did the Lord Jesus call the Pentateuch the books of Moses? Yes, he did. Yes, he did, actually. Yes. In fact, if you read the Emmaus account, when the Lord began to teach the disciples, it says, and he opened to them the books of Moses and the prophets. What he's talking about is the Pentateuch and the prophets. And at that time, the other writings would have been merged into some variation, most likely with the prophets. So basically, we're being told the Lord Jesus opens up the Old Testament and begins to teach the two disciples because they didn't understand. They chose to forget that the Messiah had to suffer. So the Lord is teaching them. Okay, so how many books in the Pentateuch? What's the first book of the Pentateuch? Genesis. It's the second longest book in the Bible. Does everybody remember what the first longest book is? Jeremiah. Jeremiah, right? And you can remember that because it's the longest book in the Old Testament, and that man still had 2 sequels. We can say that's a man who had something to say, right? So what's the longest book in the Bible? What's the second? And those of you who did the Bible study with me, you've already completed Genesis. And not only did you finish Genesis, but we went through that thing over, what, it was like 3 years? You know Genesis. And if you're saying, you know, I didn't do that one. I didn't do that Bible study, right? Or it's been a little while. It's all still on YouTube. Look at that. It's waiting for you, right? So, first book of the Pentateuch is what? How many eras of salvation history, how many epochs of salvation history are in Genesis? 2. What's the first one? Early world. Genesis 1 through 11. Just recently, this came up, Genesis 1 through 11. Someone emailed me and said, in this part of Genesis 1 to 11, is this historical? Now we know that that is a funny question because early world, Genesis 1 to 11, is prehistory. I can't tell you whether it's history or not because history didn't exist. We didn't have a field called history when these accounts were given. So well, I mean, is it literal? We don't know. In some cases, the church tells us. Adam and Eve, literal. They were real historical people. How do we know that? The church tells us. Okay, great. Other parts, we're not sure. So just recently, someone was asking me about, is this historical? Is this literal? I don't know. We don't know. The church does not give a teaching because we don't know. So you can say, oh, well, well, pause, back up. What does the church tell us? Genesis 1 to 11 uses figurative language. Now, we have to be cautious. We hear figurative language, it means, oh, that means it's not real. Whoa, back it up, cowboy, right? Right? It's like it could be very real, right? You can tell a story or an account in figurative language and it can be very real. I, as an Irish American, am very sensitive to this, right? Because our motto is, don't let facts get in the way of a good story, huh? Yeah? Because sometimes you can teach things more powerfully by using figurative language than by using facts and numbers and details, right? So, okay, so figurative language, Genesis 1 to 11, early world. So all this stuff, the worldwide flood, the Tower of Babel, we're not sure. And there are some Catholic Christians, probably because of the influence of Protestantism, who are willing to fall on their sword. No, it was a worldwide flood. Okay, you can hold that, but just realize it's not the view of the church. We don't know. It might have been, or could have just been a regional flood that felt like a worldwide flood. We don't know. Right? Figurative language. Yes? Okay, good. That's the first epoch of salvation history. What's the second epoch of salvation history? Patriarchs. Patriarchs. And patriarchs means what? Like great father, right? Great father. You know. Remember, the word grandfather does not exist in the scriptures. Grandfather actually comes from German, right? So when we think of grandfather, that's what the scriptures are referring to when they speak of patriarchs. So all you granddads out there, biblically, you're patriarchs, all right? Yeah, don't worry, mom, grandmas, You are matriarchs. There you go. So we got the patriarchs. And we talk about the major patriarchs. How many patriarchs do we want to specifically think of? 4. 4 main patriarchs. There are other patriarchs, many other patriarchs, but 4 main ones. Who is the first patriarch? Do we talk about Abraham during the Catholic Mass? Yes. We speak about the sacrifice of Abraham, our father in faith. Right? We recall to mind this first great patriarch, the one that God raised up in order to lead his people into a covenant, a solemn family-forming agreement with him. Right? Powerful. Who's the second patriarch? Isaac, exactly. Does everybody remember what Isaac means in Hebrew? Laughter. Laughter. Because Sarah, yes, Sarah, when she heard, because as St. Paul would say, she was an old lady, when she heard that she was going to give birth to a baby, she's like, first of all, I'm barren. Secondly, I'm an old lady. That ship has sailed, right? And she thought it was funny. And she laughed at God because he said that she was going to have a baby. And so God said, okay, you know what? I want you to name the baby Laughter, right? So, see, God has a sense of humor, doesn't he? So the second patriarch is Isaac. Who's the third patriarch? Jacob. And Jacob is renamed what? Israel, exactly. And Jacob, Israel, has how many sons? 12 sons. And they are all patriarchs too. I told you there are a lot of other patriarchs. We just highlight 4 in particular, right? So the 12 patriarchs, those become the father of the 12 what? Tribes. That's what we're talking about. The Lord Jesus fulfills the 12 tribes by naming 12 what? Apostles. Exactly, right? So everything the Lord Jesus did was fulfilling the old covenant. So we didn't have to play guessing games. We would know exactly, yes, Jesus of Nazareth is the long-awaited Messiah. He is the Christ of God because he has fulfilled all these portions of the Old Testament. All right, so Jacob, Israel, has 12 sons. And who was his oldest son? Reuben. Every time I say that, I'm thinking, I want a sandwich, right? And actually, I'm joking because I hate Reubens, huh? Yeah, you ever smell someone's breath after they eat a Reuben? Yeah, it's called a Tic Tac, buddy. Okay, all right, you know? All right, so Reuben, right? Reuben's the firstborn. So you think, well, then Reuben must be number 4, must be the 4th main patriarch. No, because here's what Reuben did. Reuben mocked his dad. And he slept with his dad's concubine, Bilhah. Yes, that was really her name, right? Bilhah. And he was trying, by that act, to claim the authority over his father. So God's like, you can't do that. Not only is that your dad, but that is the holder of my covenant. You cannot mock the holder of the covenant and receive a blessing from God. Reuben's out. So then we had Simeon and Levi. That's the second and third son. Did one of them receive the blessing? Nope. Nope. And you're like, now what did they do? Yeah. The sister, remember that whole account we went through this when we did the Genesis? The language of the Hebrew is very peculiar. Like, did Dana run away or was she kidnapped? Was she raped? Or did she just want to leave her family to pursue someone else? It's like, this is like the Jewish Christian version of Helen of Troy, right? Like, what really is going on here? Because the language is conflicting. Right? But regardless, something happened to Dana, their sister, and Simeon and Levi were like, we're not going to put up with this. They went, they formed a false covenant. What? They formed a false covenant. They said to this group, hey, well, let's go and form a covenant. We'll become family. And they were like, oh, this is great. Yeah, we know about your tribe. You guys are awesome. We'd love to be a member of your family. They're like, okay, great. Yeah, now first, what you got to do is you have to circumcise yourself in order to be a part of our covenant. And they're like, okay, sure, right? And then they circumcised themselves, and while they were like groaning and wailing in pain and stuff, here comes Simeon and Levi, like, killed them all, right? And you can't violate a covenant. In fact, Moses tells us in Deuteronomy, if you violate a covenant, you're supposed to be split in 2. So they weren't split in 2, they were spared that, but they couldn't hold the blessing. So, okay, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, gone. So now we go to the 4th born. Who was he? There it is, Judah. And Judah means praise God. Praise. Judah prays, right? Judah becomes the fourth patriarch, the fourth main guy. He's the fourth son of Jacob, and he comes number 4. So the first patriarch was who? Abraham. The second? The third? The fourth? Judah, exactly. So everything's about Judah. So sometimes people will read Genesis and they're like, yeah, I hear this, but I don't see a whole lot of Judah. Oh, just wait till you get to the prophets, huh? Everything is about Judah. You guys know how much I love Judith. Where's the book of Judith? What part of the Old Testament? Historical books. Where's it at? Historical books. Love me some Judith. Judith is the feminine form of Judah. And what does she say? Judith comes on the scene. Oh, no, you didn't. You can mess with the women of the north. Israel, that's what they called themselves, right? But you obviously have made a mistake because you cannot mess with a daughter of Judah. You don't mess with us. Right? There it is. There's Judah, right? So as Jacob Israel is dying, he says to Judah, the scepter shall never pass from Judah, and he will have the lions roar, and his brothers will serve him. Whoa. David, King David, comes from Judah. And we are told, scepter will never pass from Judah, and the throne of David, a son of David, will always rule over God's people. So, tribe of Judah, house of David, here we go. Who comes from the tribe of David and the tribe of Judah and the house of David? There it is. There it is. You got to know this stuff. Otherwise, you're not going to know what Jesus Christ was doing. Right? So, okay, so we got 4 main patriarchs. Tell me again, who's the first one? The second? The third? The fourth? Exactly. What's the first book of the Pentateuch? The second? That's where we are now, folks. Oh, yeah, right? What's the third book of the Pentateuch? Leviticus. Very exciting reading, isn't it? I tell you, sometimes when I'm reading Leviticus, I'm just like, I go throughout the whole day. It's like, I can't wait to get back to Leviticus, right? Yeah, can you relate? Exactly. If that's you, then you might have some problems, okay, right? Because Leviticus is what? It's the priest's handbook. It's the priest's handbook, right? Now, there are some beautiful parts of Leviticus, and there's the moral code that's contained within Leviticus that can be very beautiful and encouraging, but it's a priest's handbook, right? Remember, the Bible is a library, 73 books, different genres, different literary approaches, so you have a priest's handbook. It's a ritual book, right? So that's the third book of the Pentateuch. What's the fourth book of the Pentateuch? That's very inspiring, isn't it? Like, you know what I want to do tonight? I'm going to go home and I'm going to read the book of Numbers, right? It's like, wow, are you an accountant? You know what I mean? So, okay, we could have worked a little bit better on the title, because in Hebrew, is it called the book of Numbers? No, it's called In the Wilderness. Wilderness and desert, same word in Hebrew. So in the desert, in the wilderness. That's at least a little more exciting, right? But at least in the Christian tradition, we're a little bit honest, because the book of Numbers is filled with what? Numbers. They're always counting people. You read the book of Numbers, you're like, you people really need to find some new hobbies, right? And I love they don't just count the people, they tell us about the animals, right? It's like, who had that job? They're giving out duties at the morning, and they're like, yeah, you're in charge of counting the sheep today. There you go, you know? Or you're in charge of counting these animals, right? So the whole book of Numbers, this is Numbers. But in the midst of that, it's the account that we receive of the purification of the desert. So there's some really very important lessons and salvation history contained in the book of Numbers. So it's worth reading, even though there are a lot of numbers, right? All right, what's the fifth book of the Pentateuch? Deuteronomy. And who should we think of when we think about Deuteronomy? Moses, exactly. And Deuteronomy is considered Moses' what? Last will and testament. He's an old man. All his peers are dead. He's talking to their children, their grandchildren. He's reminding them of what has happened. And he's exhorting them, when you get to the promised land, it's going to be good. It's a land of milk and honey. But do not let the comfort rob you of your fidelity. And in particular, he tells them 2 things. Be careful who you marry. Wow. Be careful who you marry. And make sure you raise your children in the ways of God. 2 huge things Moses is stressing. Right? All right, so those are the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. Let's go over the books again. What's the first one? The second? The third? The fourth? The fifth? Good, that's the first part of the Old Testament. What's the second part of the Old Testament? The historical. Do you remember all those books? I'm going to save those for next time. Yeah, Anna, she's like, no. Okay, we're going to go over those next time. We want to make sure those are in our minds, right? What's the third part of the Old Testament? The wisdom. Good. How many books? 7. And the fourth part of the Old Testament? How many books? 18, exactly. In the 18 prophetic books, how many, listen, how many major writing prophets do we have? 4, exactly, right? Exactly 4. Good. And who is the one of those 4 that Mother Church really, really favors? Isaiah. Isaiah is actually also one of the longest books of the Scriptures, but it's one that's definitely worth reading. It's very important. And you'll hear a lot of Isaiah during the sacred liturgy. All right, that's the Old Testament. How many major parts are in the New Testament? What's the first part? Gospels. How many books? What's the second part of the New Testament? How many books? What's the third part of the New Testament? Letters, the apostolic letters. How many apostolic letters? 21. How many were written or influenced by St. Paul? 14. How many were written by other apostles? Good, you can do math fast, huh? Yeah. What's the fourth part of the New Testament? The apocalyptic. How many books? Good. How many books in the New Testament? 27. In the New Testament, 27. How many books in the Old Testament? 46. How many books total in the Scriptures? Do all Catholics and Protestants agree on that? No. Our Protestant neighbors took 7 books out about 500 years ago, right? And we went through that whole history on why. A lot of it actually pertains in principle to the Old Testament being translated from Hebrew to Greek. That's one of the big movements that eventually led to a misunderstanding and then the later removal of these 7 books. Our Protestant neighbors call those 7 books the what? The Apocrypha. Right. And is that insulting to us as Catholics? Exactly, because it means what? False teaching, exactly. They are more properly called the what? Deuterocanonicals. And how many are there? 7. See, I shook it up on you, didn't I? And some of you, well, you need to practice a little bit, huh? Right? I know some of you might be new. You're like, I didn't know any of that. That's okay. Well, I'm not talking to you. I'm just glad you're here. But those of you who have been around here, come on, step it up, folks. Right? No, it's good. All right, we ready to get back to Exodus? Good. Let's go Exodus chapter 26. We're going to cover the whole chapter tonight. And we're going to reference this chart. And to those who might be viewing in by video, a chart like this can be found by any digital search. You just have to type in Tabernacle of the Old Covenant, Tabernacle of the Old Testament, and it'll come up. So if someone doesn't have a copy, they can easily find it. All right, first, let's go look at the sheet because I want to give you a visual of the whole tabernacle setup. And we've talked about this a little bit before already, so none of this will be necessarily new. So if you look at the top part, you see you have the courtyard. That's the whole area. And outside the courtyard was where the tents were. So the tribes were assigned to different places around the tabernacle. And what tribe had seniority in terms of camping area around the tabernacle? The Levites, exactly, because they were the ones taking care of the things of God. Okay, so we have the camp area, and then we have now the courtyard. You see to the right, there's the entrance, that gate there, the 20 cubits, that's the entrance into the courtyard. There's only one entrance. So you come in, the first thing you see is that altar of burnt offerings. That's where the sacrifices would be offered. So people would bring in, and they would have the animals or various things that are being offered, the grain and so on, and that's where the sacrifice would be offered. And then beyond that, you see there's a laver. That's for the washing. So that could be for everyone in one sense, but it was mainly for the priests, so to wash and to clean. So okay, we've got the altar of burnt offering and the laver. And then, again, there's the whole courtyard, and then within the courtyard, you see you have another series of tents. And the series of tents, you see on the far right, that's the holy place. So if you go in there, you look there, you say, oh, look, there's the altar of incense. There's the table of the bread of the presence. And there's that lampstand we talked about last week, right? So, okay, that's all in there. And then you'll see there's another division, and that goes into the Holy of Holies. And then you see the Ark of the Covenant. So the most holy place, normally that's translated the Holy of Holies, the holy place, usually called the holy place, and the courtyard. So there's three movements. So if you can look at a Catholic church, you can see, for example, the narthex, the nave, the sanctuary. So portions of this is still preserved. In the Eastern church, they still have the iconostasis. So it's like a wall that surrounds the altar area, surrounds the sanctuary. That's very similar to that huge veil that we hear about in the Old Covenant. Right? In the Latin church, the Western church, we got rid of the iconostasis, but we used to have an altar rail. And then about 4 or 5 decades ago, we removed the altar rail. So this is very unique in terms of how accessible the altar is in terms of worship. And in theory, in principle, this idea comes from here. Now again, all this was fulfilled by Jesus Christ. We're not bound by this. But it gives principles and importance to us to understand, oh, if we want to worship God rightly and reverently, then this can help us. All right, so we have the courtyard, the holy place, the most holy place. Okay, if you look there at the bottom, there's an artistic rendition. So you see there's the altar burnt offering, the laver, and there's a huge veil. You see that? And those huge cherubim facing one another, right? So that was to the holy place. Now, inside the holy place, that would mainly be the priests and the Levites. Now, when we talk about the Levites and the priests, let me explain. The entire tribe of Levi was responsible for worship. But within the tribe of Levi, there was a line of priesthood. So not every Levite was a priest. There were some Levites who were just responsible for taking care of the things of God. So for example, this tabernacle, remember this is when God's people were nomads. So this had to be packed up and moved. And that was the Levites. So within the Levi tribe, there would be some that would just take care of certain parts. They would be in charge of packing things up, carrying things, cleaning things, and so on. And then you had a priestly line. And the priestly line comes from Aaron. Now, it's very interesting, as we move through salvation history, we're going to see that the line of Aaron, this is the brother of Moses, Aaron becomes the first high priest of God's people. The line of Aaron becomes more important than the line of Moses. In fact, the two sons of Moses are practically forgotten. We only have a quick reference to them in the books of Chronicles. Moses was unique before God, the friend of God. It was not a hereditary position. He stood as a prophet, the friend of God. When his vocation was fulfilled, he died. His sons did not receive that office. Aaron, however, the priesthood would be hereditary, because once God took the domestic priesthood away from his people, because they were worshiping the golden calf, God reserved the priesthood to the Levites. And so the Levites now become the priests. So they're the ones that are going to lead and preside over worship over God's people. So it's important for us to just to realize these nuances. So you have the whole tribe of Levi, but not all of them were priests. It's only a portion. That the tribe of Aaron, the line of Aaron, right, the clan of Aaron, would be the priests. And that becomes very important in terms of the record, the keeping of that line, that lineage, because you had to make sure that a priest was born within the priesthood. You couldn't just have someone show up and say, I'm going to be a priest. Like, no, was your father a priest? Was your grandfather a priest? Your great-grandfather a priest? Yes. What were their names? Right? Where did they minister? Right? What time period were they? Right? So Moses' line, there is no line. Right? He is unique before God. Aaron, there's a line. And the priesthood is found within the tribe of Levi, but not all Levites necessarily, all Levites did not preside over worship. Does that make sense? Okay, so you have this huge veil and these cherubim facing one another. Okay, then you walk in there, and you see there, and this is a little dark, but you see the lampstand, and then it points to the table of bread, the bread of the presence. So on one side was the candlestick, was the lampstand, and the other side, the bread of the presence, that table with the bread of the presence. And then in front of that was the altar of incense. That's where Zechariah was, the father of John the Baptist. when he was offering incense. And they're like, why is he taking so long, right? And then he comes out and he couldn't speak. That's where he was, right there. So that's right before the Holy of Holies. Then you see that after the altar of incense, there's another veil with cherubim facing one another. And that's the main veil. That's the veil that's referenced in the Gospels and the letter to the Hebrews, the veil that's split from top to bottom when our Lord is crucified, right? And then inside the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. Does that help to understand that movement? Okay, so with that, let's go and look at chapter 26. And with chapter 26, we go back to the big plan. So for a while there, we were talking about, okay, well, here's what the bread of the presence looks like, and here's the lampstand. But now we go back to the general plan, right, the blueprint. And remember, at this point, Moses is still with God in the cloud at Mount Sinai. God is describing to Moses exactly what he wants. And some things that can surprise us is, first of all, how thorough and precise God is. This is exactly what I want, he tells Moses. And he is demanding the best from his people. So God didn't say, hey, listen, why don't you go cheap, because I know it's kind of rough right now. No. God's like, this will be gold, and this will be a blue material. And so all these colors that are referenced, all that required dye, all that required money. Bright colors were not very popular because they were expensive, and they oftentimes didn't last in a desert. But God's like, no, I want this, and I want that, I want this. He is demanding the best from his people. Now, I mentioned this before. These are important principles for worship. If you ever walk into a church and you're like, this is ugly, right? And someone's like, oh, well, we want to go with simplicity. It's like, yeah, you want to go with irreverence, right? Our churches should be beautiful. We should walk in and feel some type of sense of the majesty of God. The church should lift up our souls to worship God. Right? That's just the church itself, the place of worship. And then the sacred liturgy, the way in which it's done, it should lead us to worship God, to encounter God. My main responsibility as a priest of the new covenant is to make sure that you, the baptized, when you come for worship, that you encounter God. Not me, not warm fuzzies, not euphoria, but that you encounter God. So everything has to be done in order for you to encounter God. And anything that's going to take away or diminish that has to be removed. Because there has to be the opportunity for the worshiper in the new covenant, the baptized person, to encounter God. And again, we see these principles illustrated in the book of Exodus. All right, look at 26, chapter 26, verse 1. Moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twined linen and blue and purple and scarlet stuff. That's a lot of beautiful colors, isn't it? That's going to be a lot of work, and that's going to be a lot of money. With cherubim skillfully worked shall you make them. So again, why is God saying that the tabernacle should be surrounded by angels? Because he's surrounded by angels in heaven. Remember, the tabernacle is the blueprint of what heaven looks like. So God is making sure that what is on earth reflects what is in heaven. So God is surrounded by angels. It's interesting that even as God is denouncing idolatry and telling his people not to make images of holy things, he is simultaneously commanding them to make images of angels. And you can imagine he's like, well, there have to be angels because there's angels around me and you have to know what this looks like. Now, it's interesting when we talk about the word tabernacle, let me mention this. Tabernacle was first and foremost a verb, to tabernacle. That's a really nice way in Hebrew to say to camp out. It's a camp out. So if someone says, okay, we're going to go tabernacle, so it's like we would say now in the French bivouac, right? It means we're going to go camp out. So it's a verb. It became a noun because God started tabernacling with his people. And the place where he was tabernacling just became known as the tabernacle. So as beautiful and powerful as the tabernacle is, linguistically it just means the campground. Right? And it's powerful because we know who is the one camping in the campground. Right? So the tabernacle. Okay, look, verse 2. The length of each curtain shall be 28 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain 4 cubits, and the curtain shall have one measure. 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and the other 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another. And you shall make loops of blue on the edge of the outmost curtain in the first set. And likewise you shall make loops on the edge of the upmost curtain in the second set. So he's being very specific. He knows God is telling him exactly what he wants. So he's not, don't go cheap on these. Verse 5, 50 loops shall you make on the one curtain, and 50 loops shall you make on the edge of the curtain that is the second set. The loops shall be opposite one another. And you shall make 50 clasps of gold, and couple the curtains one to the other with the clasp, that the tabernacle may be one whole. All right, so he's even describing how the clips are supposed to be done on the curtains, how they're supposed to be placed, how many clips should be there. Verse 7, you shall also make curtains of goat's hair for a tent over the tabernacle. 11 curtains shall you make. Why do they need goat's hair over the tabernacle? Rain, right? Now, granted, they're not going to get a whole lot of rain in the desert, but you have goat's hair because it's stronger, it's more sturdy. So if there's any rain, the tabernacle would be protected. So God's even taking care of the practicals, right? So it's not one of those places where it's so beautiful, it's impractical. It's beautiful and practical, huh? Just like holiness, huh? Verse 8, the length of each curtain shall be 30 cubits, and the breadth of each curtain 4 cubits. The 11 curtains shall have the same measure. And you shall couple 5 curtains by themselves, and 6 curtains by themselves, and the 6 curtains you shall double over at the front of the tent. All right. And you shall make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is outmost in one set, and 50 loops on the edge of the curtain which is outmost in the second set. So here God's just describing the curtains, what they're supposed to look like, where they're supposed to be placed. Verse 11, you shall make 50 clasps of bronze, and put the clasp into the loops, and couple the tent together, that it may be one whole. And the part that remains of the curtains of the tent, the half curtain that remains, shall hang over the back of the tabernacle. And the cubit on the one side and the cubit on the other side of what remains in the length of the curtains of the tent shall hang over the sides of the tabernacle, on this side and that side to cover it. And you shall make for the tent a covering of tanned ram's skins and goat skins. So again, why do we have these harder skins? To protect. To protect from the elements, to protect it also from wandering animals or dangerous things. Verse 15, and you shall make upright frames for the tabernacle of acacia wood. 10 cubits shall be the length of a frame, and 1.5 cubits the breadth of each frame. So frame. So, we've all set up things. So you got a tent or something you're setting up, and okay, you got the frame, and then you got to get the frame right, and now you've got all the curtains and how it's hanging up, right? And God is designing and telling them how to do it a certain way, because all this has to be broken down, carried, and then rebuilt. So everything is being designed to be mobile. So here's describing the frame. Verse 17. There shall be two tenons of each frame for fitting together. So shall you do for all the frames of the tabernacle. So they have to make sure they fit together, right? You can't buy something and have it come. Sometimes I think I'm being all smart. I buy something online, it comes, it doesn't fit. It was like, what is this? It's like, oh, that's what happens. You buy it from China, okay, right? So right here, God say, no, make sure it all fits, right? So you have to make sure all the frames come together and they clasp together and so on, right? Verse 18, you shall make the frames of the tabernacle, 20 frames for the south side, and 40 bases of silver you shall make under the 20 frames. 2 bases under the one frame for its 2 tenons, and 2 bases under another frame for its 2 tenons. And for the second side of the tabernacle on the north side, 20 frames, and their 40 bases of silver, 2 bases under one frame and 2 bases under another frame. And for the rear of the tabernacle westward you shall make 6 frames. And you shall make 2 frames of corners of the tabernacle in the rear. They shall be separate beneath, but joined at the top at the first ring. Thus shall it be with both of them. They shall form the 2 corners. So again, God's just describing the frames, how they're going to come together, what they should look like. You imagine like the Levites when they're traveling, and they get somewhere else, or they break it down, they're traveling and stuff, and then they get somewhere and they're like, was this one to this part? Right? And they're like, we need those notes. Who's got the notes, right? Right? It's like, they're looking at this, like, oh, there it is. Okay, all right, good, okay, right? It's like when you're trying to put something together, we always try, and then eventually it's like, oh, all right, where are the instructions? Because, God forbid we should just start with the instructions, right? Okay. So verse 25, and there shall be 8 frames with their bases of silver, 16 bases, 2 bases under one frame and 2 bases under another frame. You shall make bars of acacia wood, 5 for the frames of the one side of the tabernacle, and 5 bars for the frames of the other side of the tabernacle, and 5 bars for the frames of the side of the tabernacle at the rear westward. And again, this acacia wood is very rare and very precious. Everything that God is asking is demanding. Like his people have to go to great lengths and great sacrifices to make sure this happens. And God knows that. And he still demands it. Right? It's amazing. God will always demand our best. We think we can't do it. But he knows exactly what we can do. And it's precisely by being obedient to him we can accomplish things we never imagined. Right? This is a nomadic people a few months out of slavery. And he's basically telling them to build a palace. And they did it. Right? Because he believed in them and they trusted him. Right? Verse 28. The middle bar halfway up the frame shall pass through from end to end. You shall overlay the frames with gold and shall make their rings of gold for holders for the bars, and shall overlay the bars with gold, and you shall erect the tabernacle according to the plan for which it has been shown you on the mountain. So again, every once in a while we are being reminded this is all being told to Moses with God on the mountain. So God is the one who is describing almost this level of minutia of what he wants. Verse 31, you shall make a veil of blue and purple and scarlet stuff and fine twined linen. In skilled work shall it be made with cherubim. And you shall hang it upon 4 pillars of acacia, overlaid with gold, with hooks of gold, upon 4 bases of silver. And you shall hang the veil from the clasp and bring the Ark of the Covenant in there within the veil. And the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy. So again, here's that second curtain we saw in the picture, right? So there's the courtyard, there's that veil with the cherub. We walk into the holy place, there's another veil, and then that leads us into the Holy of Holies. Verse 34, you shall put the mercy seat upon the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. So remember, the mercy seat is just the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So it's like, okay, put the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, and make sure that the mercy seat is there. Verse 35, and you shall set the table outside the veil. There's that table with the altar of the bread of the presence, and the lampstand on the south side of the tabernacle opposite the table. And you shall put the table on the north side. So again, God's telling me exactly where to put stuff. Right? So I want the table over there, I want the lampstand over here, this is what I want the veil to look like, and so on. Verse 36, you shall make a screen for the door of the tent of blue and purple and scarlet stuff and fine twined linen embroidered with needlework. Wow. Again, it's a lot of work. These are people living in a desert. They're going to go from here and be upset because they don't have food and water. And God's telling them, yeah, you need to do some needlework, right? So all the women are getting together. That was the first stitch and chat, okay, right? You know what I mean? There it is, okay? So, verse 37. And you shall make for the screen 5 pillars of acacia and overlay them with gold. Their hooks shall be of gold, and you shall cast 5 bases of bronze for them. So again, we see the description of the tabernacle. So the courtyard, the holy place, the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, the veils, the cherubim, and the understanding of how the frames, the curtains, everything is supposed to look. Did the level of detail surprise you? And again, it shows us principles for worship. So while the old covenant has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ, those principles of worship still stand. So this is very important for us. We just finished chapter 26. We did a whole chapter tonight, huh? Yeah, and you're like, good, because I couldn't imagine us dragging that out for 3 weeks, huh? So that is the tabernacle, and we finished chapter 26, and now we're going to move to chapter 27 next week.